as the co-founder and co-CEO, 380 stores today, 84,000 team members, and a philosophy of business that has won him accolades across the country and around the world. He's trying to teach us new things about capitalism. In fact, his book is called Conscious Capitalism. Here to tell us about it and to invite you to join him in this new crusade for capitalism and freedom and liberty. Please join me in welcoming John Mackey. John, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Great to be back in Freedom Fest. I had to miss last year. I was completing a bucket trip of the safari to Africa with my wife, and she scheduled it then. And Mark Skousen was so upset. He said, "You don't have your priorities right at all. You're going to miss Freedom Fest." I said, "Well, it's either that or get a divorce." So, can people hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. So I'm going to kind of rush through this presentation. I only got 30 minutes, and I usually talk longer for it. But the good news is that after a little book signing and then a break, going to be in Celebrity 5, and my critics will be there to tell us what's wrong with the theories, and I'll have a chance to respond to that. So let's get going. Let me just declare my bias right out of the gate. I am such an enthusiastic capitalist. I believe in capitalism. I think capitalism has been the greatest creation humanity's ever done. And people just don't know how great capitalism is. And so we start out our book talking about how great it is. So let's see what capitalism has done. Just a few things. First of all, if we think of capitalism as starting roughly about the time of the Industrial Revolution, so we're talking about 250 years or thereabouts, look how much progress humanity had made over the first 1,500 years since the birth of Christ. And you can see that GDP per capita basically was flat for 1,000 years. So we sometimes hear about, oh, that was a lost decade. Well, this was largely a lost millennium, a lost 1,000 years where no progress was really made in humanity. It wasn't until capitalism that humanity began to become prosperous on a large scale. And you can see how the per capita has increased in the last 250 years. Capitalism is ending poverty on this planet. Steadily, consistently, it's ending poverty. Just consider that how much, based on $1 a day, if you consider the fact that 250 years ago, 85% of everyone alive on the planet lived on less than $1 a day. So if you were lucky or unlucky enough to have lived 250 years ago, you would have been living on less than $1 a day, most likely, unless you were an aristocrat or royal. And now we've got that percentage down to about 14%, which is still way too high. And $1 is hardly a affluent standard of living. But at the rate we're going, we will wipe out abject poverty on this planet in the next 50 years. In just two countries alone, China and India, we've had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in just the last 30 years. It has to do with how free an economy is. We know from the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is published every year, that the most free countries that have the most economic freedom are also the most affluent. You can see the least free per capita per capita incomes of $4,382 on average, all the way up to $36,000 for the most free. So economic freedom is the key indicator. Capitalism is also extending the human lifespan. Consider the fact that for 40,000 years, that all we know, even in prehistory, and Paleolithic times, the average lifespan was only about 30. And it really wasn't until the last 150 years that that really began to change. And now the average lifespan on the planet is about 69. It's almost 79, almost 80 in Japan, which is the longest lived major nation in the world. And the United States is about 76, 77. We're, I think, number 16 in the world in life expansion. But again, it's been capitalism, prosperity, scientific knowledge, fueled by capital savings that is lifting humanity out of poverty, creating prosperity, extending the lifespan, ending illiteracy. For most of the history of our species, 90+% of the people were illiterate, couldn't read. And not that there was that much to read, but it's rapidly declining. Now we're down to about 12% by the year 2015 is projected to be. So we've gone from over 90% to 12% in only 250 years. And I say capitalism, but business, of course, is at the essence of capitalism. It's business that is doing this amazing uplift of humanity. As we say in conscious capitalism, business is good because it creates value for people. Business is ethical because it creates that value based on voluntary exchange instead of coercion. Business is noble because it can elevate and has elevated human existence. And finally, business is heroic because it is lifting people out of poverty and is creating prosperity. So, business is great, capitalism is great. Here's the disconnect. Here's the problem. People don't believe that. People don't know that. And we can see from the polls, for example, that the overall favorable opinion of big business in the United States has dropped from 34% to where it currently today at about 19%. Only 2% of all the investors believe that CEOs are fundamentally trustworthy. 88% of the people polled indicate that they don't think big corporations, that they think they have too much influence on our government. And 79% believe business is too concerned about profit and not concerned enough about their workers, their customers, or the environment. So business is great, capitalism is great, and yet people don't like or trust business. Why has it happened? The world is changed. People are evolving, and yet our theories of business are out of date. We are evolving as a species. Just consider the fact that in a short period of time, 150 years ago, slavery was still legal in half of the states. 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. 75 years ago, most of the world was still organized into colonial empires. 50 years ago, we still had Jim Crow laws in the South, and we still had apartheid in South Africa. 50 years ago, there was no environmental consciousness. 25 years ago, almost half the world was still organized under either socialism or communistic governments. 15 years ago, not one person in this room had a smartphone, an iPod, an iPad. Nobody was on Facebook. Nobody was Googling. And Twitter didn't exist. None of those companies existed. It's all happened in just the last 15 years. Quick question. How many people in this room have a smartphone? Yeah, the other ones are liars. How many people here Googled in the last 24 hours? The world's changing. The world is evolving. This is one of the most important people who has lived in the last 100 years, and most people don't know who he is. This is Tim Berners-Lee. He invented the World Wide Web. This man should be the wealthiest man who ever lived. He should make Bill Gates and Warren Buffett look like a pauper, which if he had probably licensed the World Wide Web, that's what he would be today. Instead, he made it open source. He just put it out into the world, and the World Wide Web has completely changed our lives. We are better informed than at any time in history through the internet. It's just as we say, people have Googled in the last 24 hours. It's a great way to end arguments, by the way. We're more connected. There are more active phone numbers than there are people on the planet now. And Facebook has over 1.2 million active members. Now, this one's one that people have a trouble believing. we're actually getting more intelligent. The Flynn effect shows that on average IQs are going up about 3% a decade. Now people think, that can't be. I know so many stupid people. But if they had lived 100 years ago, they would have known even more stupid people, because we are getting more intelligent. And in fact, if you could somehow transport yourself back, if you have an average IQ, if you could go back 100 years, your IQ would show up at about 130. Not to mention, you could have bought General Motors, IBM, all these other stocks when nobody knew who they were. We're better educated. Our educational system might be terrible, but look at the statistics. 100 years ago, only 15% of the adult population had a high school diploma. Only 3% had a college degree. Now we're 85% have high school diplomas, and almost 40% of adults in America now have a college degree. Most importantly, we're becoming more conscious. We're more mindful. We're better connected. We understand better the consequences of our actions. We have a finer sense of right and wrong. We tend to be rejecting violence more. We're more inclusive, and we have a greater environmental awareness. What will it take for companies and for capitalism to change their reputation, to change their brand, to flourish at a higher level in the future? To be successful, companies are going to have to exemplify a more conscious way of being. And that brings us to conscious capitalism. What is conscious capitalism? We've identified basically that there are 4 tenets. 1, potential for business to have a higher purpose that includes but goes beyond just making money. Secondly, a stakeholder orientation towards the world and towards their business. Third, having a different style of leadership than we've had before, which we call conscious leadership. And fourth, having a different kind of culture, one that empowers and helps people that work for the organization to self-actualize themselves. So I'm going to take each of these briefly and try to show you what I mean by it. So increasingly, we believe that businesses should shift their focus from trying to maximize profits to what we call maximize their purpose. How do they become purpose maximizers? What do we mean by purpose? The power of purpose in a business, it's the difference that you're trying to make in the world. It drives everything that you do. It matters to all of the stakeholders who exchange with the business. It's the reason for being that includes making money, but it goes beyond it. And paradoxically, it results in making more money than you ever thought possible. What is the purpose of a business? If you ask that question, if you go back to the fundamentals, what is the purpose of a business? If you ask people routinely, if you go to a cocktail party and you say, what's the purpose of business? People will give you a quizzical look. I know, because I try this from time to time. They'll say, what do you mean, what's the purpose of business? Everybody knows the purpose of business. The purpose of business is to make money, right? That is such an odd answer. Because if you ask what the purpose of a doctor is, what's the purpose of a doctor? To heal people. What's the purpose of a teacher? To educate. Architects design buildings, engineers construct things. All of the professions refer back to some type of value creation that they are doing in the world. Only business, and by the way, doctors are very well compensated. So are attorneys, so are architects, so are engineers. They have to make a living, but their purpose refers back to their value creation. Why is business, which is the greatest value creator in the world, which is lifting humanity up out of poverty, which is creating prosperity, which is the fuel behind the great progress that humanity is making, why is business put in this narrow box that its purpose is just to make money? I think it's because the enemies of business, and by the way, business has always been hated by the intellectuals. Make no mistake about it. If you study the history, like I've studied history, you will see that business has been routinely persecuted by the intellectuals and by the aristocrats, the clergy. They've always been accused of being greedy. They've always been accused of being selfish. They've always been accused of being exploitative. Their money has routinely been taken from them. The best examples of this, if you look in the West, the merchant class, oftentimes Jews, have been routinely persecuted and run out of countries, and the same thing happened to the Chinese in the East. The merchant classes have always been despised and hated by the intellectuals, and it's no different today. The intellectuals are not the friends of business people. I mean, and when they get in power, businesses are more regulated, they're taxed higher, they're castigated, they're embarrassed. You didn't build that, is what business people hear from the intellectuals, and you don't deserve it. Part of this problem is that business has done such a bad job of defending itself, and the intellectuals who do side with business don't do a good job of defending it either. And it starts with purpose. Why does the business exist? I have known hundreds of entrepreneurs in my life, and with very few exceptions, if you ask them why they created their business, will they tell you, well, I created it to make a lot of money? No, they're usually on fire about something. There's some dream they want to realize in the world, something they want to do, something they want to create. These are passionate, creative, innovative people. And yes, they want to make money too, but what's driving them is to realize this dream, to change the world in some way, to make a difference. That passion, those dreams, are very, very seldom explained to the world. They're very, very seldom do the intellectuals that defend business talk about that. If you think about the companies that you most love and you most admire, you will find that at the root of those companies is some type of great purpose, because great companies have great purposes. Plato identified it as the good, the true, and the beautiful. I think those stand up pretty well for 2,000 years, 2,500 years in the case of Plato. Add the heroic there, and you've got a framework that most great businesses will fit into. The good of service to others, improving health and education, and the quality of life for people. The true, discovering and furthering human knowledge. Something like Google is a great example of that. And the good, you have any kind of service business such as Nordstrom's, companies like that. The beautiful, one of the things that makes Apple so successful is they create beautiful, intuitively easy technology that we love. And I think that pursuit, the passion Steve Jobs had, is what made Apple a great company. The heroic, to change and improve the world at a basic level. My favorite example of that is what Muhammad Yunus did with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and his great mission to try to wipe out poverty, and the fact that they have uplifted hundreds of millions of people. Truly a heroic purpose. Some examples of companies with higher purpose. Southwest Airlines, give people the freedom to fly. I flew down here on Southwest, my personal company jet, and what people don't realize is how transformative Southwest Airlines has been on this world. For example, Southwest Airlines was hounded by the regulations that wouldn't let them to compete on price. They're the first discount airline. They had trouble getting a license to even operate in Texas when they got going in the 60s. When Southwest Airline went into business in the mid-60s, only 15% of adults in the United States had ever been on an airplane. 15%. Today, it's pulling it close to 90%. And Southwest Airlines is a big part of that. They gave people the freedom to fly, and they still give people the freedom to fly. Google, organizing the world's information and making it easily accessible. A company that just was created 15 years ago has transformed the world in this way by following their higher purpose. As Sergey Brin and Larry Page said, the co-founders of the company, how can this purpose not get you excited? It is an exciting purpose. REI, reconnecting people with nature I'll throw a commercial in for Whole Foods. Improving the health of people, the food system, and the planet. Briefly about stakeholders. This is one of the ones that I doubt my critics will no doubt attack me for, not understanding what I mean by stakeholders. We're not talking about a different type of ownership structure. We're talking about a different way to think about the business. The stakeholders are those which the business is voluntarily exchanging with. These are the primary stakeholders. So, for example, a business has customers, stakeholder. It has employees, a stakeholder. It has suppliers, a stakeholder. It has investors, a stakeholder. And it does business in communities, which is a stakeholder. And since it has a larger impact on the environment, we usually put that in as a stakeholder as well. These are all interconnected, and I usually explain that in a very simple way. As a retailer, I know Whole Foods tries to hire the very best people we can find, pay them a good competitive wage so we can hold on to them, not lose them, make sure they're very well trained. And we have found that when our team members are happy in their work, they take better care of the customers. They give better service to the customers. Guess what? They make the customers happy. What happens when the customers are happy? They do more business with you. They trade with you more frequently. And the business flourishes, resulting in the investors making more money. Happy team members result in happy customers, result in happy investors. That is a stakeholder model in short. They're all connected. The conscious business realizes that and manages the business in such a way that all of these stakeholders who are voluntarily exchanging with the business will all flourish. And then you create a higher synergy that allows the entire organization to flourish at a higher level. Does this work financially? This is one of the questions I get from the skeptics. Oh, this all sounds good, but in the real world, it's a jungle out there. Business is war. This is survival of the fittest. This is all a bunch of squishy, soft stuff. Well, the fact is that businesses that practice a more conscious way of business have been enormously profitable. My co-author, Raj Sisodia, in a book he wrote just prior to Conscious Capitalism, which is how we met, Firms of Endearment, Whole Foods was one of the books, companies featured in the book. And he did an interesting research. He compared his 18 public firms of endearment companies, which were all conscious businesses, or what we consider to be conscious businesses. The Good to Great companies. Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, is the best-selling business book of all time by a large margin. And then the S&P 500. Look at the results over 15 years, 10 years, and 5 years. The firms of endearment companies have outperformed the Good to Great companies by a factor of almost 7 to 1 over a 15-year period. And they've outperformed the S&P 500 by about 13 to 14 to 1. The Good to Great has outperformed the S&P 500 over that time period. The conscious businesses create more value for all of their stakeholders, more value for their customers, more value for their employees, more value for their suppliers, and more value for their investors. Let's say you don't buy that argument. Perhaps you will buy the 100 best companies to work for that Fortune magazine puts out every year. If you want to beat the markets, we have a lot of investors here, you can spend a lot of money to mutual funds or to private equity firms or venture capital firms, or you could just buy Fortune's list of the 100 best companies to work for each year and rebalance every year when they come out with a new list. And over the past 15 years, you will have outperformed the Russell 3000 by 2.5 times and the S&P 500 by more than 3 times. No charge for that investment advice. Let me talk a little bit about leadership, conscious leadership. As Mahatma Gandhi said, we must be the change that we want to see in the world. You cannot create a conscious business if the leadership, particularly the CEO, is not also conscious. Impossible to do. We need a type of leader that is purpose-driven, that serves the purpose of the company, that has high integrity, that is more loving and caring, that has a higher degree of emotional intelligence, what I would call is more spiritually evolved, and is service-oriented. What we call the ideal leader is going to have different kinds of well-developed intelligences. I don't have time to go into each of these, but the type of intelligence that our schools hopefully teach us to to be good at is analytical intelligence, the ability to compare and contrast and to think logically. This was a great advance for humanity when humanity began to be able to think rationally. That is not easy to do. But in the 21st century, it's a starting point. We have to be able to think rationally, but increasingly we know in business, because it's so people-oriented, that emotional intelligence is very important. The ability to be self-aware of your own feelings and your own drives and motives, as well as empathetic to others. In my company at Whole Foods Market, we know that emotional intelligence is a better predictor of success in leadership than just analytical intelligence. I don't know how many people read Steve Jobs' biography by Walter Isaacson. Fascinating book. I loved it. Totally identify with Steve Jobs in a ton of ways. And I don't know if this is good or bad, he never would have been voted onto a team in Whole Foods Market. He would not have passed our team vote process because he was a genius, but probably not at the very height of emotional intelligence in the way he related to people. Spiritual intelligence, by this we just mean the ability to have a high ethical sense and the ability to intuit purpose, higher purpose. And systems intelligence is to see how it all fits together, to be able to see the stakeholder model, to be able to see that the business operates like a system, and that requires a certain type of intelligence. Finally, we look for servant leaders. Good leaders must first become good servants. And that means that the leader is going to serve the higher purpose of the company. They're not primarily in it just for themselves. They're going to serve that higher purpose of the company, and they're going to serve the stakeholders. And of course, they will prosper too. It's a win-win. Conscious capitalism can be thought of as a win-win-win-win-win-win philosophy. Everyone that trades with the business wins, you win, the investors win, the customers win, the employees win, the suppliers win, the communities win. That's the genius of capitalism. Capitalism lifts everything up. It is not a win-lose, zero-sum game. And this is what people cannot get about business. They cannot get this. The critics cannot get this about business. They cannot get it about capitalism. This is a uplift game where everyone who's trading is winning, or they wouldn't be making the trade. It's done on voluntary exchange for mutual gain. And as that happens, and as those exchanges multiply, the whole system synergizes at a much higher level. Talk briefly about culture. My co-CEO of Whole Foods Market, Walter Robb, says culture is the living, breathing heart of the business. It is our mission, our purpose, and values practiced over time. It is the how we do it around here. It is the petri dish in which the grand experiment and journey of the business take place. It is the most valuable asset that any company can have. And Walter's absolutely right. Now, if I had more time, I would go over what we consider the 7 characteristics of conscious cultures, which we have an acronym for: tactile, trust, accountability, caring, transparency, integrity, loyalty, and egalitarianism. I'm only going to talk about one because I think it's very important and because I think this group will, it needs to be said to the Freedom Fest group. Love. Caring. The best organizations unleash love. They have love at their source, at their core. You can build a business based on love. What we most need to do in business in the United States is to bring love out of the corporate closet where it's hiding. And that means we have to seek to eliminate fear, which keeps people from being creative and prevents people from self-actualizing at a higher level. We have to promote into leadership individuals who have a higher degree of emotional intelligence and who have a greater capacity for love and care, while also being extremely competent, powerful, and strong. It's an integration of what traditionally have been thought of as masculine and feminine. At Whole Foods, we do something we call appreciations. We end all of our meetings with voluntary appreciations, which we have found unleashes that sense of care and love in the organization. So, it really does matter how we make the money in business. Business is not a game. Business is not a machine. Business is not a math equation to be solved. And most importantly, business is not war. These are the metaphors we traditionally use in business, if you think about it. We use these type of metaphors. We use Darwinian metaphors, we use war metaphors, we use sports metaphors, and this is holding our thinking about business back, and it's harming the reputation of business in the larger world. So what then is business? Business is about the real lives of real people. It's one of the most human things that we can do. Engaging in business is something humans have been doing as far back as we have any type of records for. We are traders and creators and traders. So we should measure our success by the way we touch the lives of other people. Businesses can create, but also can destroy many kinds of wealth: financial, intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual, cultural, physical, and natural. Think about this for a minute. Business creates wealth in all of these areas. It is the most amazing thing. And capitalism is the way that business is organized in a way to allow humanity to make progress. But done wrongly or with the wrong frameworks, it can also destroy that wealth. Conscious capitalism works for all in a number of ways. It creates greater sales intensity and growth. It lowers the gross margins the company has, which results in higher net margins. It lowers marketing costs. Whole Foods spends virtually nothing on marketing. It lowers product return costs. It has very low employee turnover, and it increases engagement, passion, and creativity. It lowers legal expenses, administrative expenses. It creates resilience when the tough times come. And it creates greater well-being and flourishing. Everyone wins. So, I'll conclude. Free enterprise capitalism, engaged with an evolved consciousness of purpose, stakeholder integration, and leadership, will transform the world in the 21st century. We wrote our book for the millennials. They will create the conscious businesses that will take humanity to ways that we can barely imagine at the start of, we get closer to 2015. We must consciously create value for all of the major stakeholders, the customers, the team members, the suppliers, the investors, and the communities that we're part of. We need a different kind of leader, one who's more conscious, more awake, have higher integrity, more caring, that will create with a higher degree of emotional and spiritual intelligence than we've yet seen. As with so much else in life, it takes a conscious intent to create and maintain a positive business culture that allows human beings to flourish. And the final thing is, each of us, must continually work to evolve ourselves, our leadership, our culture, and our world. That is conscious capitalism. Thank you very much.